Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Rob Dixon, and I'm UK Director here at Han ETF, and I'm going to be moderating today's webinar. So thanks for joining us today. I'm delighted to be joined by Anthony Ginsberg, the founder of Gins Global Investment Management. He's joining us from California, and he'll be talking about the Han Gins Index Healthcare Innovation UCITS ETF and just generally the sector trends. But just a few housekeeping sort of notes before we start. Q&A, well, there'll be a 5-minute session at the end of the presentation, so please, during the presentation, just pop through questions online, and we'll do our best to answer them post the presentation. The fact sheets and white papers making the case for investing in the healthcare innovation outside Big Pharma, which is what it's all about, are available in the attachments area, so you can download those at the end of the webinar. And also, can you rate the webinar as and when it's finished, if you wouldn't mind, and obviously subscribe to our Bright Talk channel as well. So anyway, I'm going to pass over to Anthony now, and then we'll have Q&A at the end.
Many thanks, Rob, and welcome everybody. It's very timely to be talking about beyond Big Pharma and investing in the future of healthcare and medical innovation. Obviously, given the coronavirus, we've actually seen a lot of spurring on and focus on the innovative side regarding medical technology, and specifically areas such as AI diagnostics. So we're going to touch on a couple of other related areas such as telemedicine, AI software that is being used already to identify not just viruses, but such diagnostic machines such as looking at corneas and people's eyes and other areas that prior to actually seeing a medical professional, the AI diagnostics are becoming more and more mainstream. There's a particular case at the Moorfields Eye Hospital in the UK for eye diagnostics that have been utilized by the NHS now for a number of months. And things such as medical wearables and chatbots are obviously, such as your Babylon, that's also used within the NHS, are becoming more and more mainstream. So I'm going to run through a number of slides and be very happy to take questions after that. So just to move on to the very first slide, our WELL ETF actually is available on 3 exchanges in London, Milan, and also in Frankfurt via the DAX. And it covers close to 100 underlying stocks. So it's a very broad index covering healthcare innovative stocks. And it really is beyond Big Pharma. We have very little crossover with any of the big pharmaceutical companies. These are really more nimble, younger medical and healthcare companies that are global and cover basically everything from biotech to nanotechnology to diagnostics. So we'll go through that quite clearly in the slides. Just to give some brief background, given the aging world that we're finding ourselves in, a lot of the innovation is occurring in terms of biotech firms coming up with solutions for elderly people. We've also got things like robotics that are coming into the healthcare space in a bigger and bigger way. Interestingly enough, with the coronavirus issue, a number of these robotic innovations are now being utilized for remote healthcare as well, including the telemedicine. Just interestingly enough, yesterday in the US, the task force from the White House is actually promoting more and more telemedicine usage. So we see a lot more investment and focus being put in this area, and I'm happy to tell you that the medical coverage here in the US now includes 100% of telemedicine services. So remote healthcare services are becoming more and more popular, and certainly becoming a bigger awareness has been created, obviously, due to the coronavirus as well. So a number of those stocks are in our holdings, and as I mentioned, we've got close to 100 underlying holdings. So within the fourth industrial revolution, and we call it Industry 4.0, the World Economic Forum, of course, has made a big issue about the fact that we have moved from the first, second, and third industrial revolutions into 4.0. And a lot of people have asked us, well, you've launched this ETF. How is healthcare doing in terms of its development into the fourth industrial revolution? Has it been as fast as something like cloud computing or cybersecurity or even social media, which relate to some other ETFs that we offer in the technology area. And the truth is, up until 5-6 years ago, healthcare was not seen as an area that the big tech companies have focused much attention on. But in the last 5 years, firms like Google, Microsoft, even Apple, have put more energy into the space. There have been some rather large developments and acquisitions actually recently. Firms like Google are buying up and doing deals with large hospital groups, particularly in the US, to help with their machine learning, big data, and AI developments. Even Amazon has partnered with JP Morgan to create a new healthcare venture. So when one talks to the Silicon Valley executives, there's a lot more likelihood that they will be jumping with both feet squarely into the space a lot sooner than they would go after the financial services arena. I know there were a number of players in finance thinking that big tech would be moving into, let's say, asset management or banking, but the truth is the margins in the healthcare space are much more attractive to them. So we see one of the next battlegrounds for big tech actually being in the healthcare space. Actually, Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, has mentioned a number of times that one of his legacies will be Apple's move into the healthcare space. Of course, Apple Watch for them is one of the early areas of using wearables and being able to track people's, everything from blood sugar to other key health specs. And with the epidemic here that we have, besides coronavirus, the other epidemic that people talk about here in the States is the overweight issues in people's blood sugar levels. So we see these wearables. Recently, Google bought Fitbit, as many of you know as well. And that just shows that there's a lot more commitment to using medical trackers or medical wearables as we move forward. So I'm just going to go on to the next slide and talk about the applications of AI in healthcare. And you can see it covers a number of areas, not just diagnostic areas, but also treatment, things like mobile apps, virtual assistants. There are some very interesting areas such as predictive modeling. And this is actually where we see the likes of coronavirus increasingly being used for modeling. And we see AI becoming a much more mainstream area. It's still only being utilized by sort of higher-end hospitals, including people like Moorfields in the UK, but it's becoming more mainstream. And certainly we think that what's happened recently with this outbreak globally will spur a lot more technological innovation in this space, including mobile apps and chatbots. So just to look at the size of the healthcare AI, artificial intelligence area, we have experts predicting that it will grow to $150 billion in size within basically 5.5-6 years. And that includes robotic-assisted surgery. We've got a couple of very large holdings. One called Intuitive Surgical, which is the leading player in robotic surgeries within our ETF. But there are obviously other areas such as virtual nursing assistants. There are other focus areas you'll see on this page talking about clinical trials being sped up. And actually, even with the vaccine that's being worked on for the coronavirus, they're actually using AI and genetic sequencing to actually speed it up. So relative to what happened with SARS, there's been a 4-fold increase in the speed to develop a vaccine this time around. So there certainly has been a lot more money being put in the space of healthcare innovation. It may not get all the headline attention that the likes of cloud or cybersecurity or social media get, or future cars for that matter. But one shouldn't be surprised that a lot of the bigger Silicon Valley players are putting a lot of energy in this area. I mentioned Google with Fitbit, but they've also purchasing millions of hospital records to help them with diagnostic machines that they're developing. So all in all, it hasn't lost focus from Silicon Valley. One other area very briefly is in America, the aging population means that everyone's expecting healthcare to be amongst the fastest growing sectors over the next 5 to 10 years. We have the baby boomer generation, which basically means most of the after the Second World War, there's a bubble of the population now in their early 60s up through the age of about 75, 80, and that number will obviously increase and will require more medical treatment over the next 10 years. I'll just mention one other quick U.S. matter, which is that medical records are still not shared very easily between different states and hospital systems. We don't have a national healthcare here. So that's also where we see a lot of healthcare innovation on the database management, healthcare records, and that's the area that a lot of the big tech players are also moving into and possibly may make acquisitions. So a number of the companies that we own in the ETF may actually be sources of mergers or acquisitions over the next few years. I'm just going to move on to the next slide, which really summarizes the difference between our ETF, where on the left-hand side you'll see our top 10 holdings, and there's almost very little overlap with the traditional healthcare MSCI benchmark. We're using an INDX benchmark, which is really focusing on health innovation and life sciences. One of the bigger holdings, Medtronic, that we have, does actually feature sometimes in a more mainstream healthcare index, only because it is the biggest medical device company globally, and we do cover medical devices as one of our sub-themes. We actually have, at the moment, 8 sub-themes, and we'll go through that in a bit more detail. So, talking about life expectancy, obviously it continues to grow, and what's really pushing expenditure here in the U.S. and certainly in some other places like Asia is the aging population. So you can see the life expectancy has grown in this particular slide almost 6 years, just between the year 2000 and 2016. Life expectancy is now 72, and that's a global number. The billions of people over the age of 60, the aging population, again, this is part of the theme. We're just saying the number of seniors is expected to grow rapidly. And a lot of that is being powered not just by the likes of Japan, but I'd certainly say the U.S. is a big influence there, as well as China. And just to move on to an additional slide, there's been a change in the deaths and how these are now being experienced. In the old days, the number of deaths from communicable diseases like influenza and malaria were predominant, and that certainly has gone down. And you can see basically the non-communicable diseases is now almost at 3/4 of all deaths. So the world is changing, and obviously this coronavirus is also putting it squarely in place. So we can discuss that a bit further as well. I wanted to just show you another slide talking about that the risk of dying from cancer, heart disease, strokes, and other non-communicable diseases is certainly rising. So this relates to the level of care and also the level of diagnostic focus. There's a lot more money being spent in these particular areas in the tech healthcare innovation space, and that's possibly why you see the big biotech companies and the medical device companies spending a lot of energy with stents and other devices, whether it's in the cardiothoracic area, such as heart disease, cancer, or strokes. That's where a lot of the focus of expenditure is rising. Interestingly enough, big pharma, although it's growing in terms of their R&D spend, and it does look sizable from about 150 billion just a couple of years ago now to 200 billion a year, there's an increasing reliance by big pharma on biotech and biomedical and other innovative healthcare companies. A lot of the R&D is actually being outsourced. So it's not all being done by the likes of Glaxo and Merck in-house any longer. It's been a real sea change in the pharmaceutical space over the last decade. They've increasingly outsourced their R&D, and they're very happy, the likes of Johnson & Johnson and Merck, to make acquisitions when clinical trials have been proven. But a lot more of the heavy-duty lifting is being done by the biotech firms. And even in the case of the coronavirus, the most likely vaccines are coming out of the biotech space. There are 2 particular companies we've written about. one called Moderna, which is at the cutting edge of doing trials up in Seattle at the very moment, which is the epicenter here in the US for the virus spreading. So the next slide is really just a summary of healthcare spending and how it's rising up to $10 trillion by 2022. The compound annual growth rate in spending, if you look at the second line there, we talk about health tech spending in particular, is much faster than just the general healthcare spending number. So the reason we're so positive on the technology side is that the CAGR, the compound annual growth rate, is basically 16% over the last 5 years, versus just the healthcare spending in general being about a third of that. So this again relates to non-communicable diseases. And in particular, medical technology spending is rising. These are actually the med tech sales figures, or the revenues. And you can go back to 2016 and see that essentially you have more than a tripling from 2016 through to the predicted number in the next 2 years of well over $500 billion worth of revenues. It's already basically gone from about it shows 368 billion in 2016, and that number, it may not be exactly double, but it's going to most likely be above the 522 now with Corona and some of the other spurring on that we've seen just in the last couple of months. That number's predicted to be actually more. I think these numbers should be revised up. We'll try and get some updated slides shortly for you on that. The AI space in healthcare is actually one of the fastest growing, and this is one of the more exciting slides actually, because it's showing compound annual growth rate of 40% annually from 2014. So it's a massive jump, and this really relates to, a lot of it's related to diagnostic machine learning tools, and we have a number of those companies actually in our ETF, and happy to discuss it further. But it's a huge jump up in AI. Prescription drug spending is also growing significantly. It's essentially doubled if one goes back again to around 2016 and you look at the current times. And with the baby boomer generation, with the aging Asian population in Korea, particularly South Korea, we're looking also at Japan and China, we see prescription drug sales continuing to grow significantly. And a lot of this benefits the biotech space, which is one of our cornerstone sub-themes. So an area that people have asked us about is wearables, and interestingly, when Fitbit was acquired by Google, Fitbit was not making much of a profit. Google spent a little over $2.3 billion to buy Fitbit towards the end of last year, and this is just the early stages of them making a play to try to compete with the likes of Apple Watch and other trackers and wearable devices. Frankly, with such infectious diseases such as the coronavirus, we actually see the wearables market. We wrote here that it's set to double by 2023, but this is going to be reached sooner. And we talked about some of the other challenges in America with blood sugar content and people being overweight, and diabetes certainly being at an epicenter of one of our epidemics here. Increasingly, people who've got diabetic challenges are being told to wear monitoring devices and being able to avoid always having to go into the hospital, but can be monitored remotely. So we certainly see the wearables space, which is linked to cloud technology, as growing. And as 5G also becomes more reliable and the latency or the delay in getting information is evaporated with 5G, because things get sped up and you don't have the latency or delays anymore in the transmissions, we actually see 5G and cloud technology immensely benefiting the healthcare wearable space. So we actually believe that this number of 60 billion will be reached a little bit sooner possibly than even 2023 now. But that essentially is a quadrupling in the wearables market just in 5 years. So it's a significant number. Another area that we do cover quite closely is genetic editing and genetic sequencing, things like CRISPR, which in the old days would cost well over $1 million to do a full genetic workup, and now it's roughly about $800 at a typical U.S. hospital. So we see the global genetics market continuing to grow significantly. The numbers we have in one of our recent pieces, we've put an article on the website showing a compound annual growth of almost 14% in the global genomics market, from a number of about 20 billion last year in revenues to about 36 billion projected in 2024. So as price of genome sequencing falls well below $1,000, we're hoping it's going to touch about $500. It becomes a lot more mainstream, and there will be a lot more personalized medicine coming about. Bringing it back to the coronavirus, it specifically helped speed up the search for a vaccine. They've already done the genomic sequencing and coding of the virus from China. This was done already in mid-January by the likes of the American CDC and other healthcare institutes. So they have the genetic sequence. It's just a matter of how quickly can they scale up a vaccine in mass production. But this is an area that we see growing within our own ETF. So it's still a fairly small number when one talks about 40 billion in revenues relative to medical devices such as stents that have been around for much longer. But we see the genomics market, as we call it, which is really covering gene therapy and personalized medicine, is growing significantly. And at this point, only tiny amounts of DNA are even required, such as, detected from a patient's spit or maybe a tiny blood sample to really get their genetic code. So it's becoming very user-friendly, and over time we believe that cancer medicines and other mainstream medicines will be able to customize based on people's genetic code. So the idea of personalized medicine is very close at hand. We, at some of the more upmarket hospitals in the US and possibly in the UK, it's already available, but it should be rolled out a lot more broadly over the next 5 years, in our opinion, particularly as genome sequencing falls, hopefully to the area around $400 to $500 in cost for a full workup for a patient. So I just have a couple more slides to really hopefully to show you the growth in areas such as the medical device market. This is showing how the US at the moment is dominating medical devices by the likes of firms like Medtronic. We have a slide coming up which will show you some of the larger players in the medical device area. But you can see, based on the numbers from 2017 through to 2025, just the growth in the space. And it remains our largest underlying holding within our ETFs. So of the top 10 holdings, there are a couple of players that are medical device companies. These are the leaders in the space. So Medtronic on the top is really a global multinational that specializes in the space. And there are a couple of other players there that many will recognize. Some are tech players who are getting more active in the space, whether it's Siemens or Philips. There's Abbott Laboratories also, that's a well-known player here in the US, as well as GE Healthcare too. And those billions of total revenue it's an annual number, so you can just see how mainstream medical devices are at this point. This is a slide that just really talks about some of the disruption and game changes that we see occurring across the board. Some of these companies may not be as well known. I don't know if you can see on the circle, the inner circle in blue talks about biotech, medical services, and digital health. And these are the main three areas I just wanted to get across, how they're driving the outer circle, such as DNA-based or anti-aging therapies, or even genomic or other blockchain therapies that are coming. So it's just very interesting to focus on the trends. For us, the key issue really is the blue, the inner circle, talking about the digital health and biotech in particular, but also medical services too. medical services do cover the data management, because, as I say, if somebody gets ill in New York, but they've traveled there from California, at the present time, believe it or not, it can be quite hard for their records to be shared. So in America, there's going to be a lot of expenditure by tech companies to really try and build a global and a US network where data is much more accessible. At the moment, it's quite inefficient, surprisingly. The medical wearables market in particular has taken off in the US, but we've seen it spread. The most common examples are what we've talked on briefly with the watches and things like Fitbit, but it's expected to grow significantly. And there's just some numbers on the top left there talking about essentially more than a quadrupling, actually, between 2018 and 2026. It may well go even faster now with 5G networks being built out across Europe and even in the developing world as well. So we see these medical devices as a way of leapfrogging sometimes the challenges in developing markets. So places like Africa, if they can wear these devices, it may well help people and not have to spend hours on their way to facilities such as clinics or hospitals, but can rather actually be directly linked up through 5G and be monitored this way, whether it comes to their blood sugar content or other reasonably easy ways to be monitored remotely. Rob, I just have a couple of quick slides just to finish off on. This slide just talks about some key facts in the wearable tech era. We basically believe that it creates a lot more efficiencies. There's a number there that says workout efficiency improvement from body sensing. Studies have shown, according to Business Insider, that there's a 20% gain in workout efficiency because people can actually monitor what they're doing during workouts. There was a study with over 100 folks who were able to actually identify 13 disease-related findings by just going through 100 people's detailed wearable tech numbers. So we believe this is a wonderful preventive medicine system, and will more than likely be, it won't be forced on people, but there are already healthcare insurers here in the US who are encouraging people to use these devices and actually will save them on their insurance premiums if they're actually known to be wearing these devices daily. So there's going to be incentives and encouragement, and there are some very big players. One is called, I guess, Discovery or Vitality in the UK. They're also in a number of other countries where they will actually provide discounts for insurance premiums based on mostly using wearable tech, but also working out at gyms and keeping healthy. So the idea of monitoring individuals is coming increasingly into play for the healthcare space, and monitoring people on a daily basis. I mean, not just coming into the hospital or the clinic setting. One of the final slides we have is just showing the compound annual growth rate of almost 40% actually in this wearable space. We can also call it the tracker space. And of course, everyone focuses on diabetes, which I've mentioned, but also sleep tracking, activity and fitness monitoring, as discussed with Vitality. This is becoming more and more mainstream, and we've actually seen even life insurance companies in the US and some other countries providing premium discounts if their clients can show that they are actively involved in fitness and other areas. The slide here, I just thought it would be useful to include. It's really a summary of the global market healthcare outlook in 2019. It didn't include Corona, but if you include the Corona expenditures that are going to be utilized by governments and public enterprises, we see these numbers actually growing even more so. So we talk about AI in healthcare on the left-hand side, that the compound annual growth rate is expected to be almost 70% in this space between 2018 and 2022. It's quite a huge number. It may well actually be larger now. We understand there are a lot more government contracts. The White House is actually doing their best in the last month or two to actually award more AI contracts as well. We wouldn't be surprised if the NHS and other public health services increasingly contract out to third parties in this digital health space. Healthcare data analytics is another area where big tech is certainly getting more and more involved as well. And I think with that, Rob, this last slide really just summarizes AI and where the treatments are most utilized at the moment, from eye diseases like in Moorfields to strokes, heart disease, and also cancer. I'm more than happy to take questions. I know we had one or two last slides, but hopefully that gives you a good picture. There's some other interesting developments which are smaller, that are sub-themes in our ETF, such as nanomedicine, and this is still a relatively small area, but it just talks about some of the new technology and the more precise delivery systems. Interestingly, in the space, robotic surgeries are actually saving people time in hospitals. They're actually cutting down on the recovery time. The level of precision in robotic surgeries means that recent studies show that people are able to actually leave the hospital in less than 50% of the normal time spent. And more hospitals actually are rolling out robotic surgery procedures. In the old days, a hospital would actually have to buy the entire device for a few $1 million each, because they're rather expensive, but now they are leasing and renting these robotic surgery equipment devices, so it's becoming more mainstream. It's no longer going to be limited just to large hospital groups that can actually afford the training and the upfront capital expenditure, but now they are able to rent these machines and lease these machines. So we see robotic surgery certainly as an area that's going to continue to grow, and maybe this is a good one to end off on. It's just showing that at the moment, the robotic surgeries are mostly used in general surgery, but in the gynecological area, orthopedic area, urology area, they are beginning to grow into those spaces as well. The numbers from 2018 to 2026 are quite impressive in terms of where global surgical robots are growing. So we've got about a 1.5 billion number on the 2018 side, and that's going to most likely basically show a five-fold increase to over 7 billion thereabouts in 2026. So with that, Rob, thank you for having me on. I'm very happy to take some questions, and we are very excited about the space. We actually, obviously it's tragic what's going on with the current worldwide coronavirus epidemic, but it actually will help focus minds, and we believe actually the public sector will also help spur growth in this area by contracting out to many of the underlying players, many of them actually in our own ETF. As I say, we are a very broad ETF in that we've got close to 100 underlying holdings covering 8 sub-themes. And with that, I'll pass it back to you, Rob.
Okay, thanks very much, Anthony. Very interesting. Got a couple of questions, and I guess they've sort of been answered in part by what you've been talking about. But there's one which is covering the risks and opportunities to the companies in the index in light of coronavirus. So you've obviously just highlighted that the public sector will be outsourcing, and that'll spring up some secure revenues, no doubt, for some emerging players in the basket, and lots of opportunities, no doubt. But maybe you could just talk about that and potentially any risks that you foresee, whatever they might be.
Yes. I thought perhaps what I should also mention in the tech space is that there's a lot of training that's going on also for healthcare professionals where health tech is involved. So I didn't mention it earlier on, but it's worth noting that for doctors and nurses, the healthcare professionals, a lot of the worker training that's also occurring to them in the virtual reality space. So we do own one or two virtual reality companies in our ETF. But in terms of what we're seeing, who's going to benefit the most from the current challenges, not with coronavirus only, but also in areas such as wearables and medical devices and some of the other underlying areas, biotech. It's quite broad in our opinion. So it's hard to pinpoint only one or two winners, I think for us, we see robotics and genome sequencing and medical wearables, including telemedicine, as all being part of the winning team. But I think what maybe not clear to many is who's actually going to ultimately gain market share above and beyond others. And we see big tech making acquisitions in this space. So it hasn't happened in a huge way yet because, frankly, healthcare doesn't necessarily get the high level of profile typically. But now with Corona and what's happened also in the U.S. with our election coming up, healthcare is actually one of the number one, if not number two, election platforms that the likes of Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden are actually running on against Trump. So we actually do see that as a key issue. And for us, it's an important issue to consider going forward. Healthcare expenditure is going to be a huge focus, particularly in the U.S. in capital expenditure. But again, we see big tech putting much more energy into this area in terms of M&A. And Google, just most recently, we did a piece on this, talking about some of the acquisitions that they've made, particularly in not just medical devices. It's more to do with the, I would say, AI diagnostics, where we do see big tech coming in. And again, be on the lookout for acquisitions. We see a lot more M&A potential over the next 24 to 36 months in this space, which may surprise many. Rob, I don't know if that addresses exactly what you were saying, but we've got a number of biotech players. Everyone looks at our top 10 in one of the earlier slides. They really are quite unique. They don't, you can't access them in a typical MSCI healthcare or pharmaceutical index. So I'd say we are not overlapping much with any of the big pharma traditional indexes. Most of our underlying holdings are more in the mid-cap space, and that's why we see they are more likely to be ripe for acquisitions. We don't see the risks of the anti-monopolistic or antitrust issues coming in our space for big tech, because any possible acquisitions would most likely not relate to anti-monopolistic issues. Most of the players that we own have a smaller market cap than a typical tech fund or a typical pharmaceutical fund. So we're much more in the mid-cap space, I would say.
I think that's quite clear, Anthony, and sort of also answers in part the second question, which is which of the sub-themes within the Innovative Healthcare Index present the most opportunities, and obviously, you know, what you just said about the sort of mid-cap sort of bias to the sort of companies that are populating the index. Obviously, it's quite a numerous, quite a large population of stocks in the basket. You know, I suppose you know that we should expect that M&A, where it falls. If there was one sub-theme in the index which you think will get more attention from big tech or, you know, sort of big M&A buyers, is there one?
Yes, I think the biotech space will be one. Also, the other sub-theme, obviously, wearables. You know, when Tim Cook from Apple saying that his legacy is going to be in healthcare, he's basically talking about data management and diagnostics, and that's where it's not just wearables; it's also the sharing of data. I mean, Google is trying very hard to do deals with the likes of the NHS, and obviously theoretically protect the underlying patient's privacy. So they're not actually getting names, but they're trying to feed their AI or diagnostic machines with millions of data, you know, patient records across the UK, the US. So this is a big focus for them. I mean, we actually are particularly excited about genome sequencing as well. But the main area that we see big tech, just to answer your question, we see big tech really getting mostly involved in data management, data sharing of records, some telemedicine areas as well, such as Babylon, which may be ripe for an acquisition. And then you've got, obviously, the trackers and the medical wearables. I think those would be the more exciting areas that the big tech players can essentially bring on board and integrate into their existing platforms. So yeah, at this point, obviously trackers and wearables are rather small, but the fact that Amazon is now also jumping in with JP Morgan, I mentioned earlier on, they've actually got essentially a joint venture with Berkshire Hathaway as well. It's Berkshire Hathaway, Amazon Health, and JP Morgan. And Amazon's actually now got its own health clinics that they're rolling out to their own staff members. So I guess the point is that big tech is certainly very excited by the profit potential, but also just the size and the growth of the industry in general because of our population distribution here, the baby boomer generation. There's going to be a huge number of people hitting the age of 70. It's going to be the biggest number of 70-year-olds that the U.S. has ever seen in its history. It's sort of a bit of a bubble effect. So that the idea of healthcare growing as a sector and being one of the largest sectors in the U.S. economy and actually being a massive issue politically here means that we see more money being put in this space. And given Corona's situation right now, there's no doubt in our mind that the public sector, the various states here, although we don't have an NHS, they have sizable budgets that are increasing by the day, it seems, to actually bring on board tech firms or leaders in healthcare innovation, particularly obviously areas such as chatbots and remote areas as well. Given the current situation, even video conferencing is set to benefit. But ultimately, AI software seems to be a place where the budgets have grown significantly. So we see this AI diagnostic software being a major spend by the U.S. states, so who've each got their own budgets from California to New York. Sorry, go ahead, Rob.
Thanks very much for that, Anthony. Well, I think that's going to draw the to an end, a close now. So I'd like to thank you, Anthony, and I'd like to thank listeners also for tuning in today. And as I said, pick up the resources on the website in terms of the fact sheets and news white papers, and just keep an eye on what Anthony's team put out vis-a-vis the virus and impacts on the index, please. And I'm just going to say goodbye. Say bye-bye.
Thank you, Rob. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.